You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Rena Priest is best known for her poetry. As Washington's Poet Laureate from 2021 to 2023, she traveled around the state doing readings and spreading awareness of poetry. She was the first Indigenous poet to hold that role and is a member of the Lummi Nation. Now she's bringing her keen observations and sharp wit to nonfiction. She's the author of a new collection of essays titled Positively Uncivilized. In the book, Priest explores the history of broken treaties, battles over fishing rights, and struggles with cultural erasure that compose the bedrock of the modern Coast Salish Native experience. She also challenges the non-Native reader to experiment with perspective. For example, what if we maintained the kind of spiritual relationship with the natural world that put us in community with salmon instead of above them? The title of the book itself speaks to the types of stories Priest tells. Uncivilized is a term that was, for generations, used to denigrate Native people, but also one that had been reclaimed by Priest's own family and used in a playful way. When we sat down recently to talk about the book, I started by asking Rena Priest to explain her relationship to the term positively uncivilized.
It works perfectly for, when I was growing up, if we were acting crazy or if we, just being too rowdy, my parents would be like, act civilized or stop being a bunch of little savages. And I know that it's in part because they grew up hearing that from their parents, who probably grew up hearing it from like nuns and white people intending to be cruel and hurtful. And so it's kind of a way of reclaiming it. But then also when we get into today and looking at how, and still, I mean, looking at how we justify so much brutality and abuse against the natural world through thinking of it as like technological advancement or the peak of civilization. Like here we are, and we have this AI where, you can do this really powerful search, and meanwhile, it's sucking all the drinking water out of disenfranchised communities, things like that. So, not very civilized, but we still, as a culture, have set up this idea of cultural superiority over things that are really quite beautiful and amazing in the natural world. These systems that are so intelligent and so efficient at taking care of themselves and perpetuating and making the whole planet habitable for all of us. So the book kind of looks at that. It many of the essays it have topics and themes exploring those ideas.
I want to first focus on your essay about salmon fishing. It's called Fish Outlaws. And in it, you break down the local history of fish-ins and the Bolt decision and activism around treaty rights for local tribes. And you tell this much more nuanced story than I think I'm used to hearing about how the rights were denied and how tribal people fought to regain the rights to fish in their native waters. And you write about the infiltration of money and hatcheries into the sacred act of fishing. So this is a really big story. It's very layered. Why did you want to take it on in the book, and how did you approach it?
So this actually was a collaborative project funded by the National Geographic Society. We got a grant and it was going to be cross-border. It happened during the pandemic, though, and so our big plans to go back and forth and interview people. We were looking to try to interview tribal elders from that era, the Bolt decision era, and also on the other side of the border, some of the activism that happened around the Fraser River fishery. And so that project ended up not being quite what we had hoped because of the pandemic. And as the result, I ended up just researching, kind of maybe doing more of like an archival deep dive and researching what the feeling was during the Bolt decision. And, I'd always heard oral histories, but I needed to get sort of archival materials to help write the piece. And then I ended up learning about how the Bolt decision impacted east of the mountains. And then, of course, it led into questions about the hatcheries, this sort of push for tribes to put back what we took, as though we had been the ones that depleted it in the first place and not dams and canneries and overfishing for the century prior to us receiving the right. So, it just kind of took that path naturally. And it was a pretty compelling story. And then I ended up ultimately reflecting on what the fishery was and what it meant to our people before the right was taken and we were, considered poachers in our own homelands. And before we fought to get the right back, what was it before the canneries, really? And it was a really beautiful way of life that I think, of course, was altered by all of the things I just described. So I wanted to kind of put that in there too, as a to offer a little bit of perspective.
You are introducing an idea in the beginning of the book that I think is really important, and it's about perspective. And the opening poem that you share, that is The Miracle of Fishes, just like how it permeates all of your exploration of the natural world and our relationship with the natural world. Would it be okay if you would just read the opening stanza? Actually, I'm sorry. Could you read the whole poem? Would that be too much?
Sure, no, I'll
Thank
happy
you.
to. This poem is called The Miracle of the Fishes. I don't want to get into a thing where we're arguing about whose spiritual hero is better, but salmon are more powerful than Jesus. All salmon are born from virgins. Actually, they're born right up out of the earth. Female salmon lay eggs in a riverbed. The males come and fertilize them. No male-female contact is made. How chaste. Young salmon make their journey to the sea, then return to perform the miracle of the fishes. They spawn and die in their nutrient-rich bodies and blood, infused with the minerals of the living sea, feed all living beings in the salmon's natal stream. A salmon needs only itself and its journey to perform this miraculous feat. This beautiful and holy communion between salmon and all living things has been happening longer than people have been on this planet. On the other hand, basic transubstantiation requires a priest, a church, an altar, a tabernacle, an altar boy, a glass of wine, a tray of wafers, a bell, a Bible, dogma, an initiated congregation, the Spanish Inquisition, a history of burning women as witches. A history of stealing and starving Indian kids, a history of holy wars, a history of displacing and murdering heathen Indians in the name of God in order to propagate a story about a boy born from a virgin whose body and blood we eat and drink so we shall be saved. Saved from what? Not from hunger or thirst, but from everlasting damnation in the burning pits of hell, which, if I close my eyes to visualize, look suspiciously like hunger and thirst on this broken and burning earth.
I had to resist laughing out loud throughout most of that reading because it's so funny on the page, but then your delivery brings it to another level. What is that tone that you're bringing when you read? It's like a slanted tone that is really funny and livens things up in what is really quite serious material. Can you explore how you choose your read?
It's a little bit of an element of surprise to sort of have so much honesty kind of come at you all at once, or maybe honesty about a difference of perspective or perception about the world. And so recognizing that that's going to make some feelings in people. People don't like that very much usually, to have their deepest, most sacred beliefs challenged. And so I thought, well, let's just do it, I guess. Let's just say it. Also, blasphemy is so fun. It's
It's the most fun. It is so fun. I agree.
Yeah, I was raised Catholic, and so maybe I was thinking of my mom a little bit as I wrote this, like how she might take it.
My mom was Catholic too, and she raised us with all the guilt, but not much of the dogma. But I could hear her laughing her butt off at that because it is like there is a particular delight in blasphemy that I think a Catholic kid has.
I think so. I think so. Also, I was an altar server when I was in my early teens, and I just remember sometimes feeling like it was fairly comical, like the man in the dress and the little bell. Like it was my job to ring the little bell when the Holy Spirit came down on the wafers, and I just remember thinking like, man. I loved it. It was like theater. It was great theater for me. But but I think maybe there's some of that too, just like the memory of being on up there on that altar and having the congregation kind of looking at you and here comes the time for the bell, listening and then ding 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 ding. Um,
So, can I kind of circle this back around to a theme that you bring up later in the book, which is in a chapter called Reciprocity in the Age of Extinction? So, we've just heard how salmon are more powerful than Jesus, and for all the reasons you just listed in your poem. And then you start talking about in this essay, I'll quote here, since ancient times, the practice of reciprocation has been a powerful cultural force throughout the world. It is only very recently that, as a global species, we have stopped practicing equal give and take relationships with the planet's non-human communities and adopted a one-way relationship of extraction to serve the short-sighted interests of a select few. I believe the shift was caused by our turning away from localized, nature-based beliefs to adopt homogeneous, patriarchal religions, which established a hierarchy that places men at the top with all other life on the planet subjected to their whims and existing for their exclusive use and benefit, which is an extremely powerful statement. Again, it kind of gets back to your idea about salmon and Jesus. Tell me how all of that, our changing relationship with nature, in your mind, has kind of trickled down from the changing faith structures that we've adopted.
well, okay, I read the best explanation of this in Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens. Oh my God. Or maybe it was Homo Deus. It might have been the follow-up to that book, Sapiens. But he talks about agriculture, that grains basically were the genesis of these, patriarchal creation stories. And because you could no longer, you were ejected from the natural bounty of the world and had to toil in order to make these grain crops, which people at the top benefited from the most, right? And so I love that he breaks it down so clearly in his writing. Had read Sapiens and Homo Deus, right after sitting in on a series of talks by Arnold Krupat, who is a scholar of Indigenous literatures, who taught at Sarah Lawrence for many years. He just said something so striking one day. He said, out of all of the Indigenous literatures and stories, because he had like surveyed thousands and thousands of creation stories from Indigenous communities over the span of his career. He said, I never found one. There's really only one that I know of where human beings rise up out of the dust and are cast out of the community around them, the garden, essentially. And he said, all Indigenous stories, they rise up out of the dust and are introduced to the other beings and shown their place in the circle. And I just thought that was so profoundly beautiful. Yeah. And so I had heard that during the pandemic and then read the Harari and then came into contact with those ideas. And it all just was like, yeah, this is really resonating.
Mm. Just in our final couple of minutes here, you were talking about stories and the power of stories, in addition to talking about language and our culture and the way that we interact with the natural world. What is the power of stories, like what you're bringing here in Positively Uncivilized, to shift perspective and to shape how we live?
Well, I feel like so much of how we live is created by stories. Stories our families tell us, stories we hear from, I guess, the wider the popular media, stories we hear in our communities. It really shapes our thinking and our relationship to the world. And so I think that to be conscious of the stories we tell ourselves is a really powerful place to begin shaping reality and to be conscious of the stories that we tell, not just to ourselves, but to each other. I think it really makes a huge impact in who we are and how, how we relate to the world. And so I kind of explore that a little bit through this collection. And then also looking at like the therapeutic aspect of telling stories, and changing the story, because some of the narratives that I grew up with about my identity were not very good for me, and they were imposed upon me by the outside. So, despite the stories that were told about who we are around the dinner table, you still have to go out into the world and try to understand and try to reconcile that with what the world thinks of you or how the world behaves towards you. So you really have to kind of do the work to tell your own story about who you are and where you come from. And to also really internalize the story of history and try to make sense of it in a way that is going to be helpful for you ultimately. So that's a little bit of what I'm doing here.
Rena Priest is the author of Positively Uncivilized. She's a member of the Lummi Nation and a former Washington State Poet Laureate. She is reading at Third Place Books in Ravenna tonight at 7 p.m. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. I appreciate you so much.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. By the way, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.